Good evening, everyone. Good evening to you. Welcome to the webinar of Immigration and Taxation Arrangements to Ireland, organized by Bartra Wealth and Advisors and Oldham Solicitors here in Hong Kong. So good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're speaking, where you're listening from. So my name is Gordon Oldham. I'm the senior partner of Oldham Solicitors here in Hong Kong. They say always start with the narrative, always start with a story. I'm not sure if this is a great story, but I'll start with the image. And that is 200,000 years ago, outside a little cave in the Rift Valley, that fateful day when the father of his little family and his group of fellow villagers, or cave dwellers, turned around and said, you know what, guys, let's go for a walk. I've heard that over the valley, there is better water, there's better fruit, there's better game. So let's just go and find something better. So they started off, and basically, since that walking out of Africa, it's never quite stopped, has it? I mean, we've been walking for 200,000 years now. Sometimes we've been forced out by religion. Sometimes we've been forced out by persecution. Sometimes we've been forced out by, well, there's a myriad of reasons why we would leave. But basically, at the end of the day, I think it's because we want a better life for ourselves and for our family and for our clan. So there's nothing new about it. And I always think that the desire to walk and go elsewhere is something that we've been doing so long. It's really up there with procreation and communication. We've been doing it ever since the early days, and it's not going to stop now. And apart from singing and dancing, it's probably the most popular sport. So we've seen people at the moment, they're coming from the Middle East, they're coming from Syria, they're being bombed, they're having their houses destroyed. We've seen people, for example, in South America on the march to North America, again, for the same reasons, or everybody has their own particular story. And the argument for or against immigration, of course, is not, this is not the forum for such. But if we're going to do it, what we have to do is we've got to do it properly. And in the right hands, I think it can be an easy exercise. Of course, it's complicated, the laws, the taxation, it's a very difficult thing, but in the right hands, we think we can get you there. And tonight, what I want to do, I want you to take away that the experts that we're presenting tonight and the schemes that we're suggesting that you consider here tonight are the best in class. So I'm going to talk later with you and probably come up with another story. I make it up as I go along. I'm going to give you a little background to the trust and how it might work and why you should consider using a trust. But first of all, I'm going to introduce you to James Hartshorn. He's the CEO and co-founder of Bartra, and he's an expert in Irish immigration investment. And he's going to share information with you. Following that, we have two heavy-duty tax accountants sitting in Ireland. That's Gordon Hayden, who's from Conway and Carey, and Gillian Conway, who's an associate director from the same firm. And they are both experts in advising on international and domestic tax issues with clients across all the sectors. Then at the end, we will have a question and answer session if we have time. I think there are the facilities for you to pose questions as we go along, so don't be shy. Each party will have 15 minutes or so to speak, but feel free to give us your questions, as I've mentioned. So without further ado, James, enlighten us, please.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Gordon. Very interesting story as always. So thank you to Gordon and all the team at OLN for all the work you've been doing behind the scenes to get this together. Also thanks to Cooney and Carey for their participation. to Gordon and Gillian. So I'll quickly run through this and give you an idea about Ireland as a country to immigrate to, the immigration policy, what will be required, and then very briefly just on some of the immigration trends, particularly in Hong Kong. So if we go to the first slide. So yeah, when you're looking at a potential country to immigrate to, it's obviously a big decision, it's a family decision. So it's very important to understand the criteria of the country, whether you meet that criteria, obviously, and then to understand the investment. Most of these programs come with an investment attached, so it's important to understand the investment safety particularly, and then also to understand who you want to be working with to get you there. There's usually procedures required, there's file documentation, and there's application processes, so it's important to know you're with the right person. So what I'm going to talk through today will illustrate hopefully most of this. Okay, next slide. So Ireland is a very interesting country. I'm sure it's popped up on people's radar before. As of the end of the year, we'll be the only English-speaking country in the EU. Ireland's also been the best performing economy in the EU for the past 7 years. Ireland is home to most of the major Fortune 500 companies, and they use Ireland as their European base. They do this for two reasons. One is because Ireland has an incredible education system, and as such, we have a very strong workforce. So big corporates like Google, like Apple, like Microsoft, like Amazon, all of the major technology companies and other industries, they're able to come to Ireland and they're able to hire C-level people. They're able to build very strong teams. Google have over 10,000 people in Ireland now at this stage. So this isn't, the other reason is to do with taxation. So there's a very big difference between Ireland and some of the tax havens where people have a sort of brass plate. In Ireland, these companies are here in a very big way. And that's a really strong driver for the economy. They all employ huge numbers of people, and then as such, that creates a huge flow of income into the economy. So you can see some of the companies that are here. All of the major corporations, as I mentioned, have a presence in Dublin. Okay. Ireland is also, and this comes down to standard of living. Ireland is a very beautiful country, scenic-wise. Using a lot of movies. We have extremely high quality food production. And that's due to do with how fresh and clean the air is. And it's also voted the third best sit country in the world to live. So it's a very, very attractive place for economic as well as environmental reasons. Okay. Yeah, so I touched on education earlier. So the education system in Ireland, it's obviously English speaking, so we're an English speaking country, as well as that it ranks in the top 7 globally. So I think every one of the Irish universities ranks in the top 5% of universities globally. And it's, as I said, the reason that all these major corporations choose Ireland is because we've got one of the best educated workforces in the world. And obviously, a big consideration for people, certainly the people I've met in Hong Kong, when they're considering a country to immigrate to, education is very high on that list of priorities. Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, Ireland is the fastest growing economy for the last, it's actually 7 years in a row. And then, yeah, so it's bounced back to about 6.3%. And because Ireland is home to so many of these corporations, particularly corporations that haven't been affected by COVID, notably pharma companies and tech companies, that's obviously, that's a very good and positive impact on the economy. So the downside from COVID will certainly be lessened given the quantum of these enormous corporations we have there at home. Okay. Yeah, you can see here retail sales have bounced back. Okay. I mentioned this earlier. So Ireland is very much seen as a gateway to Europe and the UK to a certain extent. A lot of these companies choose Ireland because it's English speaking and because of the sort of strength of the workforce. and then they'll use that as their European base. In some cases, it's European and MENA bases as well. We have two very esteemed tax experts, so I'll let them talk more on that. But basically, just our corporation tax is one of the lowest in Europe at 12.5%. Okay. You can skip the slide. Yeah, so this is just a very quick overview of some of the trends we've seen. Obviously, in the last 12 months, there's been a significant increase in demand for immigration products. At the end of May, there was Google searches were around close to 41,000. That's it's a very hot topic, and it's very in demand. And obviously, Ireland being one of the only major English-speaking countries whose program suits a lot of people, it's obviously a very attractive choice. And we've seen a huge increase in demand from Hong Kong, so much so that we opened an office there around this time last year, actually. And now we've got a fully staffed office with in-house lawyers and in-house document experts. So everything that you would need in order to get your file together. Okay. So I'll talk quickly now about the IIP. So essentially, the program it's very fast and it's very straightforward, which I think is why people like it. The only requirements are that you need to be over 18, and then obviously if you're the main applicant, yourself and your spouse will qualify, and any children under 18 and children between 18 and 24 if they're financially dependent. Obviously, like any program, there would need to be a clear criminal record, and then the other requirement, and the only other requirement, is that you have 2 million euros worth of net worth. It can be made up with any asset, so property, art, stocks, anything really. Okay. So there's 4 options available to people, but today we're just going to talk about one, which is the one that sort of most people will go with, and this is the investment of 1 million euro into an Irish enterprise. So the Irish government, via INIS, who manage the program, have said a few times that their preference for investment is into nursing homes, social housing, and what are called primary care centres. We're the largest developer of new build nursing homes, and one of the largest developers of social housing in the country. So these are the 2 asset categories into which we put our IIP investor funds. Okay. So there's been a lot of controversy around passport sales in Europe. 2 countries were mainly involved in that. That would have been Cyprus and Malta. They both had passport programs, which basically allowed for people to acquire passports via investment. The Irish program is not a passport program. It's a residency program. And where you've seen a lot of the criticism from the EU is to do with passports. You can see there the quotes. I mean, they just, the EU have made it very clear that they do not want countries selling passports. So it's just important to differentiate between a passport program and a residency program, which the Irish program is, a residency program. Okay. So I know that was kind of quick, but it is a very simple program. Its processing times now are running at 6 to 7 months. There was a slight delay with COVID, so maybe this year was a bit slower than usual. The processing time, as I said, sort of inside 7 months. The residency requirements, so this would be the time that you would need to live in Ireland, is only 1 day per calendar year. So it's very flexible for people. If, for example, some of our clients might want to stay in Hong Kong, but maybe send their kids over to Ireland to be educated, it allows for that because they only need to visit 1 day per calendar year. So it's very convenient in that regard. And as I said, yeah, it's a very straightforward process. The investment term is 3 years, and then I'll come to that a bit more. So I'll just give a quick intro as to who we are. So Bartra are one of the largest real estate developers in Ireland. If you go to the next slide, we develop quite a diverse range of assets. So that we develop across like 6 asset categories, which is can you go to the next slide, Aaron? Which is more than most Irish developers. A lot of Irish developers will be very specialized in one, whereas we're quite large across all the major real estate sectors. So we have a big commercial real estate portfolio. We have a large resi portfolio, residential. We're also the largest builder of co-living, which I know has become very popular in Hong Kong. We're also involved in renewable energy. And then the two asset categories that qualify under the program are healthcare, in our case, nursing homes, and social housing. And I'll talk a little bit more about how those deals specifically work. Okay. So within the Bartra group, there's a number of companies, and we set this company up 3.5, 4 years ago to deal specifically with immigration via the IIP. We have 5 offices across Asia. So we have offices in Shanghai, where I am now, Beijing, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and Ho Chi Minh. With mainland China was primarily our busiest market, and in recent times, Hong Kong has got a reasonably good share of the market now at this stage. So our group is sole purpose is to raise funds via IIP. Okay. So as I said, we build social housing and nursing homes. The reason the government prioritized these is that they're both very undersupplied in Ireland. So there's a huge undersupply in both categories. Our aspiration is to build over 1,000 nursing home beds and over 1,200 social housing units. So in terms of the deal that we offer to clients, the social housing option is a 3-year loan with no interest, and then the nursing home investment is a 5-year loan with 4% interest paid per annum, and that's paid on maturity. And both come with a full corporate guarantee from our parent company in each asset category. Okay. Yeah, so this is just sort of, why us. We've got one of the best track records. Sorry, we've got the best track record in IIP. We've had over 250 approvals now, with another 50 on the way. We've got the best track record. It's very visible. We put live construction cameras on all of our projects so that our investors can actually log in real time and see the ongoing construction of a project. Why Ireland? As I mentioned, it's very fast, it's very straightforward, it's a quick approval. If you do move to Ireland and subsequently get a passport, the Irish passport is the only passport in the world that will give access to the UK and the EU. That's via something called the CTA. If you just Google CTA Ireland, you'll see what that's about. Yeah, there's only 1 day residency required a year, so it's very convenient. Okay. Yeah, so again, this is just a bit more about us. So the group have over 1.1 billion in different real estate projects at various stages. We've had 250 successful clients, as I mentioned. So our current pipeline, we have about 435 social housing units, and we've about 823. So these are either built or in the process. As I said, our aspiration is for 1,200 social housing units and 1,000 nursing home beds, which would put us as the largest group in Ireland. Okay, so I'll just quickly wrap up. So the program is, as I said, very straightforward. Ireland is a very attractive country to be in because Ireland is the best performing economy in Europe for the last 7 years, as I mentioned. It's the only English-speaking country in the EU, and also has one of the best education systems in the world. The program itself is very quick and very straightforward. Approval times should be within 7 months. The investments are very clear and straightforward. How we structure our investments are very clear and straightforward, with a very clearly defined exit. We're one of the largest real estate developers in Ireland. We have our lending partners are every major bank in Ireland, so all of the pillar banks, and then all of the non-bank lenders lend to us on all of our projects. So that, again, just bolsters the sort of credibility of who we are and how strong the projects are. The Irish government themselves, via the ISIF, which is the Irish Strategic Investment Fund, have invested with our company. So there's a lot of third-party validation for the company, which I think is really important. And then, mindful I'm running out of time. I think we're gonna have a Q&A at the end. So if there's any other questions people have, we can share those, and I think there's also a facility to ask questions. But as I said, we've office in Hong Kong with 7 or 8 people. So I mean, if you ever have any questions, you can just pop in for a chat. So thank you for your time. And as I said, if there's any questions, we can get them later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, James. I would like to just ask a quick question, though. This program is geared towards a visa ultimately ending in a passport. Is that?
It's entirely up to the applicant. So basically, if you choose to move to Ireland, there is a road to citizenship. You're in no way prioritized. So basically, anyone coming to Ireland, there's a residency requirement that needs to be fulfilled in order to qualify for citizenship. And that's around, the quickest way it could possibly happen would be sort of 10 to 12 weeks, or 10 to 12 months, 10 and a half months a year for 5 years. So it's basically a full year of residence minus 6 weeks for travel, etc. And then after that, then you would qualify for an Irish passport. But the program itself is a residency program, but when you're an Irish resident, you do have a road to citizenship.
I see. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay.
Gillian, Gordon, you're on next. Perhaps you'd introduce yourselves and your company, and then let's get into the wonderful world of taxation.
Thank you, Gordon. Hello from Dublin. Yeah, let me give a brief intro about ourselves here. This is obviously Gillian. I'm Gordon. Cooney Carey were established in 1985. We're an Irish-based business. We have a team of over 40 experts that specialise in audit, advisory, business services and tax. We're a member of Russell Bedford International. I think if you want to have a little look at our website, www.cooneycarey.ie, you can see some additional information when you have time. So I might just go on to the next slide, please. I apologise for putting this slide up, but as I'm sure Gordon will appreciate, tax is a very complex area. No two cases are the same. So, you know, the message I would say here, picking up on what Gordon said earlier on, it really is all about planning for your specific situation. So if anybody would like to have a chat about specific circumstances, you know, please feel free to reach out to us, you know, contact Gillian or myself, and we can take it from there. But I'm going to continue to use the word through this presentation, and it's sort of funny, Gordon picked up on it earlier, plan. It's all about planning. That's the nub of it. In terms of this presentation, what we're going to try and do is give you a flavour of the Irish taxation system. I want to touch on the types of tax that we have, the tax rates, some planning opportunities, and then I'm going to highlight a potential pitfall. I'm sure you can appreciate, you know, we could probably spend half a day talking about the Irish tax system, and myself and Gillian might well enjoy it, but I'm not too sure that you guys would. So I'm going to try and keep this as relevant as possible. So next slide, please. Yeah.
Back one.
Sorry, back one. Yeah, so if we look at the Irish personal tax system, I think you're going to see pretty quickly that it's not a tax haven scenario. If you look at our personal tax rates, our tax rates range from 20% up to 55%, which is pretty high if you look at any personal tax systems across the world. We have a capital gains tax rate here. I believe you don't have capital gains tax in Hong Kong, but I will touch on that again in a moment. But a capital gains tax rate of 33%, which is again quite high. The scope of these taxes is mainly a residency-based tax basis. I know in Hong Kong, for example, that you have a territorial type system, so there's a significant difference there. Our year of assessment runs from January to December, and similar to Hong Kong, if you have disclosable income or gains, you would be obliged to file a tax return. So I suppose the message here is that the tax rates are high, but if I use that word again, plan, if we plan, if we take appropriate measures before you come to Ireland, we can minimize your exposure significantly. Next slide, please. I'll just touch briefly on capital gains tax because it is a tax that some of you might not be familiar with. It's a capital tax, as the name would imply, and it would apply to disposals of property, stocks and shares, foreign currencies, other assets. As I say, the rate is 33%. There are some exemptions and reliefs. I won't go into that detail now. The main point, I suppose, is it is in the main a residency-based tax, and I'm going to expand on that in a moment. So next slide, please. So here what we want to look at is how you would become resident and or ordinarily resident in Ireland. There's 3 points I want to touch on here. The first one is the area of residency itself. Then we have ordinary residence. And the third point we need to touch on, which is really, really important, is domicile. These 3 points will dictate how you are exposed to taxation in Ireland. So I'll start off with the basic residence tests. There's 2 tests here. The first one is fairly straightforward. If you're in Ireland for 183 days in a calendar year, you'll be regarded as Irish tax resident. The second test is a 2-year test. If over 2 years you're in Ireland for 280 days, with at least 30 days in each year, you'll be regarded as Irish resident. Outside of those specific tests related to days, you can elect to be Irish tax resident. And, you know, again, this is something you would need to be careful about, which is why I'll always talk about planning. The advantages are you might gain access to additional tax credits, but the negative is you could expose income that's not otherwise chargeable to Irish taxation. You could expose that to Irish taxation. So again, we need to be really careful there. Ordinary residence is a pretty straightforward concept. You become ordinarily resident in the 4th consecutive year of being resident in Ireland. And once you're ordinarily resident, you remain so until the 4th consecutive year of being non-resident. So that's important, particularly when you're looking at your exit strategy. The final point I want to touch base or talk about here is called domicile. Now, this is a difficult one because in our tax law, we talk about people being domiciled or non-domiciled, but we actually don't give a definition in our tax law of what domicile is. So we tend to look to case law, and essentially the concept is around permanency. It looks to where your permanent home is, you know, where are you connected to? For the purposes of this presentation, we're assuming that you are not domiciled in Ireland, and that is where some of the planning opportunities are going to arise, as you're going to see shortly. So I might just go on to the next slide, please. So I'm trying to pull what I've just said previously together in one slide here to try and make the situation crystal clear. If we start on the left-hand side, if you're not resident, ordinarily resident or domiciled in Ireland, and that's, you know, James was talking earlier on about somebody coming here for possibly a day or a short period of time. Well, you're going to fall into this box here, and you're only going to be taxed on Irish source income. So, you know, that could be, for example, deposit interest or rental income if you had property here. If we move to the middle box, I think this is the box you're more likely going to be looking at. And that's when you have become resident or ordinarily resident, but you're not domiciled in Ireland. And here you're going to be taxed on Irish source income, but you're also going to be taxed on foreign income that is remitted to Ireland. And that's really important. And we're going to expand on that in a couple of minutes. On the right-hand side, you're looking at people like myself and Gillian, resident and domiciled in Ireland. We're in trouble. We're taxed on everything. We can't do anything about that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Gillian now, who's going to give an example that will put context to everything I've just said. So Gillian.
Yeah, so we're just going to take an example to kind of think about the resident's position in practice. So in this case, we have Jack, and he comes to Ireland from the US on the 1st of September, and he's going to stay in Ireland for the rest of the year. And before he came to Ireland, he'd never spent any time here. So just taking that period from 1 September to 31 December 2020, he would have been present in Ireland for 122 days. So looking at the 1 year and the 2 year tests that Gordon referred to in the previous slides, Jack wouldn't be resident in Ireland under either of those tests. So for the whole of 2020, he'd only be subject to Irish tax if he had Irish source income during that year. And because he wouldn't be resident, he wouldn't be entitled to any Irish personal tax credits. So you need to look at what types of income Jack would have and think about if it was a benefit to him to elect to be resident in Ireland, which would potentially reduce the Irish tax payable on his Irish income for 2020. That could work particularly if he had, say, only employment income in 2020. We could claim another relief in the same year and maximise the tax relief available to him in that year. But the important thing to remember is if he had any other types of income, non-Irish income in 2020, it could bring that income within the scope of Irish tax, where it might otherwise not be. And then next slide, please. So then if you look at 2021, so he wasn't resident on the days test for 2020. But if you look at the 2-year test, so taking 2020 and 2021 together, he'd need to have 280 days in total. He had 122 days in 2020. So he'd only need to be here until early June 2021 to be resident in Ireland for 2021. That would even be if he left Ireland in June or July, he'd still be resident in Ireland for 2020 for the full calendar year from January to December. And on that basis, he'd be subject to Irish tax on Irish source income and also any non-Irish income that he brings into Ireland. So it's just to show you how you kind of look at residence, not just in 1 year, but you kind of have to look over the days spent in Ireland over a pattern of years, and how that can affect you in your year of arrival and also your year of departure. Back to you, Gordon.
Okay, we go to the next slide, please. So again, I'm just trying to simplify the situation here in relation to the capital gains tax that I mentioned earlier on. If you're not resident, ordinary resident or domicile in Ireland, you will only pay tax on gains on Irish specified assets. We like our land here in Ireland. So essentially what we do is we retain a tax charge in relation to Irish land. Moving to the box in the middle, which I think is going to be the more relevant box for somebody who's resident, ordinary resident, but not domiciled. Here you're looking at your Irish source gains and foreign gains remitted. And I'm going to touch on that now shortly. On the right hand side again, it's for somebody domiciled in Ireland and they're caught pretty much on everything. So next slide, please. So I mentioned there this whole idea of remitting income or gains into Ireland. So, you know, what would a remittance of income or gains into Ireland look like? How could it happen? Typical examples are cash amounts physically being brought into Ireland, amounts transferred to an Irish bank account, proceeds of a non-Irish loan brought into Ireland, repayment of a credit card balance from an Irish income or from non-Irish income or gains. So in essence, those things are bad. They can give rise to an Irish tax exposure, and this gives rise to the planning opportunity. Income or gains accumulated before becoming resident in Ireland are regarded as capital. Remittance of capital are not subject to Irish tax. So that is the planning opportunity for somebody that's not domiciled. If you could turn over the page, please. In essence, what you need to do is plan what you bring into Ireland. Bring in capital, less of a problem. Bring in income or gains, we have a problem. I would just say as well, just be careful of what we call constructive remittances. An example of that could be paying an Irish credit card balance from a foreign account. That could give rise to a tax exposure. Could we move on? Next slide, please. And one more. Have we time for that example?
Yeah.
We have an example, and one more, please. Yeah, Gillian's just going to give a quick example in relation to the remittance basis. I'm conscious we're running out of time, but I would like to get this example in if we could.
Sure. So this is just another one looking at the days tests again. So Jane comes to Ireland on the 1st of June 2020. So as a result, she's here for 214 days in 2020. So she would fall under the residence 1 year test. So she's regarded as resident for the whole of 2020, even though she only came here in June. So she would be subject then to Irish tax on any Irish source income during that period, and also any foreign income remitted. So taking that as an example, say she had accumulated capital before coming to Ireland of say 200,000 Australian dollars. And during that 2020, she also was in receipt of Australian income of 20,000. So now, and that income went into the same bank account as her capital had been saved in. So the total funds in that account is now 220,000, of which 200,000 is accumulated capital and 20,000 is income received while she's resident in Ireland. If Jane remits income from, or remits monies from that account to Ireland, it's first deemed to come from income, and then only once that income is depleted from capital. So if she transferred 10,000 Australian dollars from her Australian bank account having $220,000, that $10,000 will be taxable in Ireland during 2020. Just go to the next slide. So this just shows a planning opportunity that's available. If Jane, before coming to Ireland, set up a new account and separated her capital accumulated before coming to Ireland from any income received after coming to Ireland, she could take money back from her capital bank account without it being subject to any Irish tax. So you can appreciate that that use of separating capital from income can be really maximised to limit your scope of exposure to Irish tax. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Sure. So I think we're under pressure from a time perspective here, but this is one I want to mention because it's a potential pitfall. We have another capital tax called capital acquisitions tax, and that applies to gifts and inheritance that somebody might receive. The tax is payable by the recipient. So in the main, this isn't a problem if you're going to be leaving Ireland before 5 years have elapsed. If you're going to stay on a longer term basis, once you move into year 6, you could find yourself liable to this tax. So for example, if let's say you possibly inherited money from parents in year 6 or 7, or assets that aren't even in Ireland, you could find yourself with an Irish tax charge here in relation to this, and it's a 33% tax charge. That's a particularly nasty one. But again, with planning, we believe you can plan your way around this. Next slide, please. These are just the thresholds that apply in relation to CAT. So if, for example, you received an inheritance of €1 million in value from your parents, the amount over 335,000 would be subject to tax at 33%. So again, the message here is plan to avoid this tax. Let's see what that message is there. Yeah.
Next slide.
Sorry, just one back, please. So just, you know, when you come to Ireland, it may well be that you decide to buy a property, or you could indeed rent. But if you buy a property, just a couple of things to be aware of. We have a stamp duty. So if you were to buy a property with a value of, say, €1 million, you have a stamp duty at 1%. We have a local property tax that applies on an annual basis. Just off the top of my head, a property valued at about 500,000 or 600,000, the local property tax might be €1,000 a year. A point I touched on earlier, when you leave, be aware that if you keep the property, you will continue to be chargeable to tax on rental income, and you would be chargeable on the disposal of the property. Now, in relation to property, there are tax efficient ownership structures that you can put in place, and I believe Gordon may talk briefly about some of those. But again, it's just back to this message of, you know, before you do anything, consider what money you're bringing into Ireland, and, you know, consider, is there a more tax efficient way to own property? Next slide, please. So in summary, I think what we're saying here is Ireland is by no means a low tax jurisdiction on the personal tax side, but as you've seen, if you take appropriate action, you can minimize your exposure to Irish taxes. If you're staying longer term, over 5 years, don't forget about estate planning, because that CAT charge can be particularly nasty. And then finally, you know, in the context of acquiring a property here, you know, think carefully about that and look at what structure will give you the best outcome. So that's it from us, I think, for the moment. We'll take questions whenever the opportunity arises.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you very much. Nice name, by the way. My father's from Ireland. Are we all called Gordons over there? And thank you, Gillian. I am a lawyer, and, you know, I spend most of the day looking at papers, but I'm convinced, but even after an hour or so, my mind starts to wander, I'm afraid. And on top of that, to look at a PowerPoint. So nice presentation. I think it's something that our audience has to go back, look at, and I'm sure they'll have lots of questions. for you. It's not a tax haven, that's correct, but as we've mentioned, it's all about planning and either minimizing the tax or deferring it. I want to go to an area where, as you mentioned, Gordon, there is good scope for minimizing or eliminating tax, and that is with the use of a trust. And everybody has heard this mention of trust, but it becomes some vague legal notion that people aren't quite familiar with. They've heard the name, but they don't know exactly what it means. And for that, I want to give another story, but this is a recent story. And it's I'm going to give it by way of illustration of how the trust came about. And as I say, it's a recent story. We only go back to the year 1200 for this, not 200,000 years. So I want you to imagine in Europe, or in England more particularly, when Lord, and of course he's not called Lord Setlaw, but I'm going to call him Lord Setlaw, decides with 65,000 of his fellow European Christians that it might be a good idea to go to the Middle East and fight against Islam. And they were called the Crusades. And the trouble with the problem that Mr. Setlaw had was the following. He was a lord. He had his castle. He had his land. He had his peasants. And that was the sum of his assets. And now, and of course, on top of that, he has a family. He has a wife. And now he wants to go and fight a war. Doesn't want to immigrate this time. He just wants to go for a limited period only and fight a war. Now, his problem is the following. What happens if I don't come back? What will happen to my castle? Now, in those days, don't forget, like in the rest of the world, fortunately it's changed since then, women couldn't own property. It just wasn't possible. And in any event, even if they could, maybe he was a bit reluctant to give her everything and then find himself replaced by the time he came back or didn't come back. So what was Lord Setlaw's dilemma? I've got to find somebody who won't run off with my wife, my castle, and my lands. And if and when I come back from the Crusades, they will give me that back. And in the meantime, if I don't, they will look after my wife whilst I'm away. And if I die, they will ensure that for the rest of her life, she will enjoy my assets. And after that, for my children and their children and their children, until I can create a dynasty, basically. So what did he do? He went to old wise uncle, who is thoroughly trustworthy, and he gave these assets to the uncle because he trusted them. And lo and behold, that person was the trustee. And the trustee, in essence, was holding the assets on behalf of the Setlaw, Lord Setlaw. And if he never came back, he would, of course, look after the family and the children, etc. Now, of course, we've been doing that, i.e. going off to war in the 1300s and the 1400s, and it's what we regularly do. Now, of course, that's when we were being chased by religious whatever, or it may be other persecution. Now, of course, we've got the IRD, the IRD, the Inland Revenue Department, or the IRS, or somebody wanting to tax the hell out of us. We might be pursued by by divorce proceedings. We may be pursued by somebody who wants to get at your assets because he's got a multi-million claim against you. And we basically want to take these assets that we have and we want to put it somewhere. And this is how the trust over the past 5, 6, 7, 800 years has evolved. In the UK, it has become an established area of law with a lot of case law behind it and very well established. It is less regarded full stop by some European countries, but certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's something that we should actually use and have been using for hundreds of years to protect our assets. Now, if I could go to the first slide, please. Second slide then. So here we have Lord Setlaw on the left. We have the Setlaw. He's given everything to the trustee, and he has named certain people who will benefit. And it can be himself, of course, include himself. And we have the beneficiaries. It may be children. It may be a charitable organization. But these are the beneficiaries. The trust itself, the trust finds it difficult to open a bank account, to hold property in its own name, to register a car, do any of these things. So underneath it has a holding company, that limited company. Into that holding company, we settle properties, bank accounts, funds, other assets as we go through life. Next slide, please. That's another slide showing the same thing, basically how the settlor established a trust deed where he writes out what he wants. He also, at that time, directs his trustee. Now, I once had to describe for ING, I think it was many years ago here in Hong Kong, and it was an amazing concept to the vast majority of the agents who were selling banking products. And they used to say, let me get this right. You want me to take my house or my bank account or my assets or my business, my factory, etc. And you want to force me, you want me to give it to somebody who I don't know, a trustee, be it a bank or somebody. And then you want me simply to tell him what I would like him to do, but I can't force him to do it. And yes, that's why the concept as a whole to people in this part of the world and to a lot of other parts in the world find it difficult to grasp. The irony is that the less you control that trust, the more it's going to be enforceable. So next slide, please. So when I talk about a trust being enforceable, you cannot, for example, give something to your best friend and tell him to hold it, but at any time you could go to that best friend and have him pay it all to you. Courts, whether they are matrimonial courts, whether they are civil courts who are trying to enforce a judgment against you, will look straight through these. But a tax that is established in a proper manner can save you the risk of losing a lot of assets in both divorces, litigation, etc. But from a tax point of view, it offers a world of opportunity to either defer or to minimize such. So in simple terms, in the context in which we're talking today, if the trustees are not in Ireland, and they are resident overseas, and they are holding assets of yours, and those assets generate income, save if it's income generated in Ireland, you will not be paying tax. Now, that's a broad statement. There are some exceptions for capital gains, for Irish real estate, when you make a capital gain on it. But by and large, Gordon has already made the point several times, and I did at the beginning, that with the right planning, you can actually use trustees and the concept of a trust outside of Ireland to save you an awful lot of money in tax. So next slide, please. And again, I think it's probably a bit late to go through the specifics of this, but as I've mentioned, if the trustees are not resident in Ireland, they will only be liable to income tax if you've got any income sourced in Ireland. Next, please. All right. Again, it's something that will depend on the specifics of the case. Most of you who might be interested in this program may be buying land, buildings, etc., which will be, I'm afraid we can't get away from capital gains if you're an Irish resident. But for a non-Irish resident trustee, there are exceptions where CGT is payable, but by and large, there will be no CGT. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, of course, I'm sitting in Hong Kong, and I've been a lawyer for many, many years, and I set up trusts. And up until about 7 or 8 years ago, Hong Kong was not our first choice for jurisdiction to set up a trust. It is now. There are co-equals, of course, but since 2013, there have been developments in the trust law here, which makes it quite desirable to have the trust set up here. Of course, this is an unmitigated pitch for you to use us to create the trust for you. And we've been doing this for many years for other jurisdictions as well, as tax saving, as a tax saving exercise. I've set out here a few of the benefits to Hong Kong. Of course, it would take a 10-page comparison with other jurisdictions. And it's like any job, quite frankly, you pick the tool that is appropriate to the job, depending on where you are, what you're trying to do. That's just a few of the advantages to Hong Kong, on the assumption that a lot of you are here in Hong Kong, you're familiar with our court system, with our rule of law, and you are happy to consider Hong Kong as such. Next, please. All right, that's it. As I say, just a quick overview to take out some of the mystery of what a trust is, and to emphasize that you cannot start to think about investment programs and going elsewhere and putting your money somewhere unless you plan the tax. And an integral part of the tax consideration has to be the question of a trust. So I'm going to take some questions right now. Let me see. Okay, the first one here is, James, perhaps your company highlighted the immigration project as a safe investment backed by the Irish government. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Okay, so our investments, so there's not all investments have government backing. So it's not that the program is a program where all investments have government backing. The two assets we build derive their income from the Irish government. So that's specifically what I meant. There are other assets that are not backed by government revenue, things like hotels, for example. Although hotels aren't really allowed anymore, but there used to be hotels, so there's still some sort of product in the market. So how are those assets, how do they derive income from the state? So the social housing that we build, we sign a 25-year lease with the Irish government. It's called an enhanced lease. So if someone wanted to just Google enhanced lease Ireland, you'll see that the three main selling points, three main sort of pillars of that. The lease is 25 years in duration. It's index linked to inflation, and the value of the lease is 95% of market value. So let's say we have a block of 30 units. They're all one bed, which they wouldn't be, but for the sake of an example. And then the one bed next door is being let for €1,000 a month. Ours would be €950 a month, 95% of market value. And the difference between us and the guys next door is that we signed a 25-year lease with the Irish government via the local authorities. And that's index linked to inflation, so it would go up over time. And irrespective if rents fall in the area, it won't affect our rent. So if the guy next door went from 1,000 to 600, ours would still be at 950 for the next 25 years. So what this means is that we've created an income producing fixed asset who's deriving its income from the Irish government. So it's an extremely easy asset to sell, particularly to pension funds, any institutional buyer really, but particularly pension funds. So that's our exit strategy on social. And then in the nursing homes, the state pay a subsidy through the NTPF, and this is an NTPF rate, and it's a fixed rate per bed, so per occupied bed. So if we have a patient in a bed, we then would receive this fixed rent from the government on a weekly basis. So in those two cases, that's where the government backing comes in, because the income streams are derived from the government. But it's not the case that the scheme is somehow backed by the government. The scheme is very much a government program that allows private companies raise funds. And in our case, we're a private company, but we just happen to build two asset categories who derive their income from the Irish state. So that's where the government backing comes in. But there are other IIP projects that don't derive their income from the Irish government.
Thanks, James. So now, in the limited time, let me ask you the most obvious question. On the assumption that most of our audience are in Hong Kong, what do you say to those who say, Ireland, never even heard of it? Why not Australia, Canada, US, the usual suspects? I know it's a long answer you could probably give, but why Ireland?
Well, if you want me, there's two ways I can answer. I can kind of reiterate what I said earlier, that Ireland is the best performing economy in the EU. It's the only English-speaking country in the EU. It's home to all of these Fortune 500 companies, so it's an incredible place to graduate. So if you're doing this for your kids, for example, which most of our clients are, it's a very attractive place to graduate. If you come out of Trinity or UCD or whatever, you've got all of the major corporations in the world on your doorstep, and they're all running graduate programs. They're all hiring. They're all looking for new talent all the time. They're still expanding. I mean, Salesforce are hiring in Dublin at the moment. Amazon are hiring. So even now, when we're about to be in a global recession, these companies are still hiring. So that's a hugely attractive element to it. Why is EB5 or US not popular in Hong Kong? I think it's to do with the global taxation policies of the US. From people I've spoken to, Canada is probably the most chosen choice, historically, definitely, for Hong Kongers, but it's not everyone's cup of tea, so sometimes people want something else. It might suit them for a variety of reasons. The program itself is quite technical. Getting the files together is quite tricky. Australia is 5 million, so it's 5x. Well, I suppose with the currency 3x the cost. And as well, some people prefer Ireland over those two countries. That's the main reason, I think. So yeah, I think that's probably why.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for you to expand on what you just said now, that we're on the verge of a worldwide recession. We'll save that for another day. I don't think we have any more questions, and we're at 6:31, so I'm going to hold it there. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. Gordon and Gillian in Ireland and James up in Shanghai, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, every member of the audience who's joined us for this last hour. And we hope to see you soon. And let us know if you have any further questions or need to know more. And I'm now this I'm a bit unsure, but if anybody would like a copy of these slides, if you haven't already recorded or whatever, please just do let us know and we'll send you a soft copy of such. James, Gillian, Gordon, any further words?
Just quickly to wrap up, as I said, we have an office in Hong Kong. We have great people there. So we're in TST. So we're in the K11 Atelier building, the new K11 on the 7th floor in there. So if anyone wants to pop in at any time, more than welcome. You can find our website as well, bartrawealthadvisors.com. A lot of information on there. There's some very informative videos. So we do have a lot of content and we've got great people there on the ground. I usually go to Hong Kong a lot. I can't at the moment, obviously. But I mean, we've got everything you need in our office. So if anyone has any questions at all, we really welcome you to come in and see us. And thank you again for putting this together.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Gillian, Gordon. Thank you, everybody.